Dr. Jazz.
Definitely. I mean,
Jazz.
but Niels, I would like to start with one thing. You know, I've been listening. I wrote to you in the email. I listened to your music for such a long time. Really, like, you know, of course, the '80s stuff, which I hope we will dig into a little, and then the
Yeah.
later stuff and the latest trio, it's also beautiful. I mean, River of Time, and but I just first want to ask you, you know, to get into the mood for our talk, I listen these days to your music some, and I checked, like, you did a lot of touring last year. I mean, with this super group, which really is a super group, and playing these kind of modern standards, like, you know, Bruno Mars and Shakira. I know you did that already during COVID, like solo and at home. But how did this project happen actually, and where's the idea come from?
Yeah, actually, there's two. I toured with two different super groups last year. One was we called it the Modern Standard Super Group with Billy Cobham, Randy Brecker, Bill Evans, and Lindley Martz.
Yeah.
And the other one was called the Jazz Take Super Group with Bill Evans, myself, Daryl Jones, and Harvey Mason. Where there's a distinct difference between the repertoires, but they're very closely related at the same time, and they stem from both projects stem from something I've been working on for a very long time, which is an attempt to renew the jazz standard repertoire, basically. So I started doing this, I think, many years ago. I mean, I've been making records since 1986, so I'm putting out my 44th album soon. So I forget exactly when it started, but maybe in the 90s, sometime in the early or mid 90s, maybe. But really, what I wanted to do is try to renew the jazz standard repertoire, which I think has stagnated somehow, because most of the jazz standards, the tunes we call jazz standards, are really, most of them, not all of them, but most of them are really pop tunes from the 1930s and the 1940s.
Yeah.
And so what jazz musicians did back then, they took these tunes and used them as vehicles for their improvisations and their interpretations, and it gave the people a chance to something to hook on to, because they knew all the songs. These were very, very popular pop tunes of the time, so everybody knew them. So when they heard Charlie Parker or whoever, you know, do this kind of song, they would recognize it, even if he was doing like some really avant-garde progressive improvisation over them. And this was such a success that the jazz versions of these pop songs outlived the original versions, and then subsequently these jazz musicians kept playing them, and other new generations of jazz musicians began to play them also. So essentially, they became interpretations of interpretations of interpretations, and after a while, nobody remembered where the original song came from, for the most part. So, like, if you ask young jazz musicians today, what Broadway show, or where does Stella by Starlight come from, or where does
My Favorite Things or whatever,
My Funny Valentine or something, a lot of people will not even know, but they will know hundreds of versions of famous jazz artists who have recorded these songs. So this is all good, because most of these songs are really great songs. So they certainly did deserve a timeless life, you know. But I'd always thought it was strange to abandon the original intention with taking such songs, you know, to be able to have the audience have a point of reference. So I started experimenting with more contemporary pop songs like in the mid 90s, I think, were recording mid and late 90s recording songs by Michael Jackson or Bob Marley or Eric Clapton, Peter Gabriel, and like that. And it's not a given to do that, because since the jazz repertoire evolved since in the 30s, you know, the jazz is such a young art form that the language has evolved only, you know, it's like a work in progress.
Yeah.
So it has evolved. The vocabulary has evolved based on the rhythmic, structural, and harmonic context of these old pop songs from the 30s and 40s. So it's not a given that you can just take it and apply it to modern, more contemporary pop music, because the harmonics, the structures and the forms and everything is so different.
Yeah.
But it is possible. It just requires a dedicated effort. So I started experimenting with that for a long time ago, but then very recently, last few years, I started to do it in a more concentrated form, like doing a lot of entire projects that dedicated to these type of songs, and so I did really in two different categories. I took more contemporary songs that are very well established already, like songs by Sting, Neil Young, or entire repertoires like new wave from the UK in the 80s, or grunge rock from Seattle in the 90s, post punk from New York in the 70s, you know, and did arrangement of those, and then as a separate category within these projects, I did current pop songs. You know, I during COVID, I think it was during COVID, I decided to record a new song every month, and going on the Spotify or whatever, and find the top 20 songs, pick one that I thought could be suitable for a jazz interpretation, and then I would within 2 weeks have it recorded and put up on YouTube. I did that like for I think over a year in a row, you know, that was so that's a whole nother story, you know, and those pop songs typically only known by so we call those modern standards. So those are typically only known by really young audiences, like, you know, 15 years or younger, and then up until max 25. So when we go out and play jazz festivals last summer, you know, I think people appreciated the concept and also appreciate the tunes, but a lot of these audiences had never heard of the artists that they come from, you know, Dua Lipa,
Jason Derulo,
and Taylor Swift, and so on. So that's basically what we're doing. So we did that Modern Standards tour last summer around the European festivals with the current pop songs, you know, and then we did in the fall, we did a tour with Jazz Takes. We call it Jazz Takes, which is more older stuff, you know, by Sting, Seal, Patti Smith,
Nirvana. You do, right? Also, I saw.
Yeah.
And Soundgarden.
And you know, I'm lucky to have had since 2020 a kind of a residency at the Louisiana Museum of Modern Art here in Denmark, which is a very prominent modern art museum, and they have a nice concert hall. So we do these monthly concerts there where that we call Jazz Takes, and we take a new genre every time. You know, we had Mike Stern come in and do a jazz take on heavy metal, and then we had Greg Hutchinson come in and do a jazz take on French electronic music, and we did Alvin Queen just came and did 90s Britpop.
Wow, man.
Oasis and stuff like that. And then we did Lenny White came and did 80s UK new wave. Billy Cobham did 90s Seattle grunge, and so on and so forth. So it's really we and Steve Rodby and Paul Vertigo from the Pat Metheny group, they came and did a 1970s disco.
Whoa.
Which was really fun,
did you record this stuff?
So yeah, some of it. Yeah, we actually
okay.
recorded Alvin's Britpop concert. We also recorded we started to record. I think in the future we'll record all the concerts and see what happens. But that's basically the background of it, and so I do that in a dedicated effort in parallel with writing my own new original music all the time, which is what I've always mainly been doing. But yeah, I think some of these tunes, when you tour with them, some of them survive better than others, and there are definitely ones that are have serious standard potential. Like for instance, all the musicians love playing Willow by Taylor Swift in this arrangement. That's a one you can just keep playing it. So the way we've arranged it, there's so much room for improvisation and taking it wherever you want, and it's a simple melody to learn, just like most jazz standards, so you can really get into it really quick. So that's really fun.
How did you approach these tunes are mostly, I mean, when we talk about Sting or Peter Gabriel, already those tunes per se are offer so much, like you take Salisbury here, it's 7/4 already, it's interesting. But these modern tunes, like Shakira or Dua Lipa, they're fairly easy. What was your approach there to make it? I mean, when you grab a tune, how do you do it? I mean,
I what I look for when I choose the tunes, I look for melodies that that I personally like, but also melodies that have that lend themselves to reharmonization. So what I generally tend to try to do is to keep the melody intact. The original melody, I keep it intact, at least for the notes, not necessarily the rhythm. But if you keep the notes the same, and you can change the rhythm, and you can take it pretty far without losing the identity of the songs. I think the notes, the sequences of notes, is the first thing. So I take those notes and I experiment with them at the piano with reharmonization, put new harmonies under it, under each note, and see where it goes, and then I try to think of it as I really, once I've transcribed the melody, I really put the original version far away and try to not think about it, and then I really approach these melodies as if it was
just a melody.
If you listen to a lot of modern jazz compositions by, I don't know, Chick Corea or whoever, Michael Brecker or whatever, you can some of them are very often, more often than not, they're quite simple in terms of structure and melody, and then how the harmonic part is usually where it gets sophisticated and complicated. So so that has kind of worked. And then what I do is for the solo form, the improvisation section, sometimes I use the original harmonies from the song, but a lot of times I will create new solo structures that are based on some harmonic elements from the original. Because a lot of modern pop music is very vamp based. It's the same harmonies as just the loops, which can be fine. But if you're doing a whole repertoire of songs for it, and you have 5 different soloists who are going to solo, you may need some variations. So sometimes I change the key. Like for instance, speaking of Steve Rodby and Paul Vertigo, we did an arrangement of the chic Nile Rodgers song, disco song from the 70s called "I Want Your Love," and that's an A minor. So I came up with a reharmonization of the melody that worked really well, and then for the solo I went up a half step, took it into a B flat, and then added some more chords but where the chord movement or the bass line movement was derived from the melody. Those kind of things, do these kinds of little tricks, and then I try to think of it in terms of a very traditional jazz instrumentation, like for instance, it could be trio, piano, bass, drums, or quartet, piano, bass, drums, tenor saxophone, or quintet, piano, bass, drums, saxophone, and trumpet. So an acoustic, so it's really got that jazz sound. So no matter what you play, if you just play one note, it's going to sound jazz just from the instrumentation, you know. Then if you get into jazz harmony and you can go pretty far with these tunes that you know, on the French electronic jazz take that we did, I decided to have 3 horns, you know, alto saxophone, tenor, and trumpet, and I wanted to have the same instrumentation as the Miles Davis kind of Blue album, but only using themes by a famous French electronic artists, like from old ones to new ones. So those Jean-Michel Jarre, Justice, David Guetta, and so on and so forth, and that worked well too. You know, to have that kind of recognizable sound, like a context of modal chord progression, and then 3 horns, trumpet, alto saxophone, and tenor. Then you got that kind of blues sound, and all of that. You know, it's already in a jazz mode, but that works too. So, and it, you know, I have to say, these concert series that we're doing, they've been quite successful. You know, it works as intended. People who know these songs come out to see the gig and wondering, you know, wow, wonder how this is going to sound, and they love it.
Yeah,
we even had the melody, the heavy metal jazz take. The heavy metal jazz take we did with Mike Stern and the Moutin brothers from Paris.
Oh wow!
We had one of the leading jazz, the leading rock metal media in Denmark came to review the concert, and they loved it. Absolutely. We were nervous, you know, at first. You know, what are they going to think? We were butchering sacred canons, you know. But they loved it, and I'm really glad they did that, because I'm thinking, you know, for guitar, Mike Stern is such a great guitar player in that cross section between rock and jazz, that if anyone has a chance to appeal to those people, it would be Mike, you know. And I'm happy he was willing to do it, because a lot of these guys, you know, these older jazz guys, they're like going, "What? You want to do what? What?"
How did Mike react when you presented him? I don't know, Metallica, I guess, or Megadeth, or what you guys?
Yeah, we did Metallica song too. That was really cool. Yeah, he was quite open in the beginning, but that's because we already did one kind of similar, actually 2 similar projects with him.
Okay.
And in the beginning, those were the first time it was hard to convince him to do it. But the first one he did for us was Jimi Hendrix. So we did a concert of all Jimi Hendrix, and I knew that was going to be easier to convince him to do than other stuff, because he's such a Jimi Hendrix fan himself. You know, he's so heavily influenced by Jimi. So of course he already has a Jimi Hendrix song that he includes in his own live repertoire sometimes, you know. So I thought it wouldn't be impossible to convince him. And we managed, and we did it, and it was a huge success and amazing. He played Hendrix like you wouldn't believe. It's completely insane. So that was great. So then we brought him back for a return engagement where it was not Hendrix but psychedelic rock.
Wow, really?
Psychedelic. So we did some Hendrix. We did some. What else did we do? Cream. I forgot what we did, but
Pink Floyd or something, or
yeah. I think we did some Pink Floyd, and yeah. Anyway, we did
amazing.
And he was open to that too, because it went so well the previous time, and that was a big success too. So I think by the time we came back to him and said, hey, how about doing heavy metal, and here are the songs we'd like to do, and he was like, okay. And it went really well, and I even included one of his own songs in the repertoire. That I found one of his songs that completely fit, that had like a kind of a really rock metal like bass ostinato that sounded like it could have been a Metallica tune or something, but it just was one of his own. So yeah, it worked out real good.
That's beautiful. Yeah, I love it what you're doing. I mean, especially when you have such bands, also it helps to bring the music really together. That's of course amazing. But Niels, I wanted to ask you. You said you've been writing music ever since you remember, like since the mid '80s or even earlier, I guess.
Yeah.
What's I listened to River of Time, and you wrote beautiful stuff like Sita Smooth. I love that melody. It's so lyrical.
Thank you.
And beautiful music you wrote. Like, what's your approach when writing music? You sit down on a piano? Do you have like a sketchbook, or like what's your process there?
Yeah, well, first of all, from a very early point on, I realized that most of new, especially younger, of my own generation or younger jazz musicians, most of the original music they write is not very melodic. It's often very sophisticated and very, a lot of substance and quality in it, but it's not very melodic. And I realized that past, previous generations, even the very recent ones like Herbie Hancock, Chick Corea, and those kinds of generation players are very capable of writing very, very melodic melodies. And I just started to quickly establish that as a very important value in music for my own set of values. So I really set out to develop a strong melodic sense from very early on, and I not only for writing songs but also for improvising. I love Wayne Shorter's quote when he says, "Improvisation is composition is improvisation in slow motion."
Yeah.
So it's really two sides of the same coin. So yes, I've worked very consciously of thinking melodically what makes a strong melody. Studying great songs or artists or composers who are capable of writing great melodies. And analyzing. Breaking it down. And then I also had I went to Berklee College of Music in the early '80s in Boston. I also had a few good teachers that taught me some good tools. Some of motivic development. You take one motif, and what technique can you use to develop it, and create a melody out of it. Those stuff. I've worked very consciously with that. So what I what I try to do, well, after having mastered those type of techniques to a certain degree, you know, I think the more you do it, the better you become at it. And what I try to do when I write music is I really well, I've tried all kinds of processes, but I found at one point I discovered that my best tunes, the ones that I look back on and say, okay, this was good and this is going to last. I'm going to keep playing this. And I realized people like these tunes. The ones that kind of stick out, I realized that the way they were written, they had something in common. And what they had in common was that the way I write them is I sit down at the piano and I sometimes close my eyes. You know, I often play with my eyes closed if I don't have to read anyway. But then I try to paint a picture, metaphorically speaking, of something, a mood or situation, a memory or a situation, an atmosphere, something, and or it could be a mental image. You know, like one time I got asked to write a theme for a movie. The movie never happened. Like the company went bankrupt before the movie went into production, but I still had written the tune. And the way I wrote the tune was I read the script, the opening scene of the script, and I tried to write a piece of music that fit that mood. And that became a very good melody that actually didn't take a very long time to write. So I try to write basically film scoring to mental images. That's how I
that's
put
good.
It.
Yeah.
So that's why a lot of the times I will write I will give them titles that have a relation to what I was thinking about when I wrote the tune, and they're often related to things that are going on in my life at the same time as when I write the tune and stuff, you know. So
yeah.
So So that's
yeah. No, it's good. It's good. It's like, you know, I like your melodicism always, like this, but this is a good idea also. Yeah, I sometimes get stuck when writing music, you know. You sit down and you start complicating, like, this is like a 7-8 bar I'll squeeze in here, and then like, oh shit, I'll quit. Like,
yeah,
and it's just,
I mean, it's a very interesting fine line, you know. You know, the writing for oneself and writing for an audience, because that's also another thing. So what is it you want to accomplish with what you're writing? And a lot of times it can be, you know, intellectual self-satisfaction, you know, coming up with some brilliant mathematical solution to how to go from point A to point B harmonically and melodically, and that can be rewarding and it's satisfying, of course. But then most of the time I try to think of a feeling that I have, you know. I feel a certain way, and I'm thinking, how do I convey that feeling to a listener, you know? So and some of the tunes of mine that I'm the most proud of are the ones where when I hear them again, even years and years later, when I hear them, I instantly recognize the feeling that I had at the time when I wrote it. Like, for instance, I'm just thinking about, there was an album I did in 1989 called Dreams.
I
did it in New York, and I was just seriously contemplating leaving New York at that time and moving to Paris, and one of the songs is called That's It, and I wrote it when I decided, okay, I'm gonna move now. I'm gonna move. I'm going to do it. And when I hear it, I hear that feeling. You know, it's all about that. The way it was structured, the energy in it, the build up and the release and all. It's just about that. And then there's another song in there that's really totally New York. That captures all the things I liked about New York and that I knew I was going to miss. You know, so when I hear that again, I get the same feeling. So yeah, that's kind of how I approach it. I know a lot of people approach it from an intellectual point first, and then try to add the emotional component in afterwards. But I do it in reverse, basically.
Yeah. It's so many different approaches, but it's always nice to hear. You know, this if you get stuck to, you know, for me at least, egoistically, that's why I talk to you guys. Yeah, like, oh shit, okay, that's a nice solution, you know. Like,
but the great thing about composition is that you can, I mean, and about jazz in particular, you know, you're hired to be an improviser, so you're hired to be creative on command. You have to come up with something at a given time, and it's a great exercise in creativity, and you realize that you can actually create a lot out of almost nothing, you know. Like if you do just 1 or 2 notes and then apply, you know, a concept of motivic development, and you can like make a lot of stuff out of almost nothing. Like Michel Legrand comes to mind, the great French songwriter, composer. Most of his tunes, actually, if not all of his tunes, are generally based on one motif. Just one motif, and he just takes that motif through all kinds of key changes and reharmonizations, and he's really a master of that. It's almost borderline, you know, repetitive, sounding like an exercise, but then not. You know, he's taking it just before it gets over the top, but he really makes a point in creating entire tunes out of just one single short motif, and it's pretty a pretty clear example of how much you can do with very little. Instead of searching for complex solutions to whatever, you can just take what you already got and then expand on that. That's nice too.
Yeah,
it's
like
kind of what I try to do on the tune you mentioned before, Sita's Mood.
Yeah,
it's basically based on one motif, or kind of a question and answer. So I guess you could say one motif and then an answer as a question and an answer to that, and a new development of that motif and a new answer to that. So, but it's really based on very little.
Yeah, but the melody is so strong, you know, the initial one. So that's why it works, because you're like, wow, shit, that's so beautiful, man. You know, you're like, okay, that's like the best melodies are like that. You know, it's like, you're like, oh, shit, 6 notes and like, whoo, okay, it works, or however many, you know. But
great that you're doing these things. You know, it's really valuable documentation to have many people talk about these things, because there's nowhere else really to do it these days, you know.
Well, thanks for, you know, everyone who's taking the time, including you. Just you know, there's so much musicians out there. Like, I just go through my record collection and I'm like, man, you know, I'm it's scary. That's so little time, but so much incredible music. It's always nice to hear different perspectives, you know, how people got into things and how they improvise or write, or, you know, it's so nice to hear this. But I wanted to ask you about one thing, you know, which I mentioned in the beginning. You know, how did you get involved into, I mean, I know you went to Berkeley, like you said, and then moving to New York, but where did the initial idea come to go to Berkeley, and then this transition to New York? How did these things happen, and your involvement in the New York scene, which includes basically everyone you played, like, I think.
Yeah, good question. Because I'm from Denmark, born and raised here, but I don't know if you know this, but in Denmark, or Copenhagen in particular, has a very unique jazz history in the fact that a record number of American jazz legends, predominantly Black American jazz legends, came here to live in the mainly in the 60s and 70s. So there was like a flourishing jazz scene around them. It started with Stan Getz in the late 50s, and his bassist at the time, Oscar Pettiford. They settled here. And then by the early 60s, a lot of other people start coming, like Kenny Drew, Dexter Gordon,
exactly.
Ben Webster, and then Ed Thigpen, Thad Jones, like Mercer Ellington moved here.
Oh, really? Oh, I didn't know.
Yeah, Quincy Jones lived here for a little while. Horace Parlan, the piano player, Ernie Wilkins. I mean, the very long list of American expats, and naturally, a whole scene evolved around them, and including a scene of emerging young Danish jazz musicians who got basically mentored by these guys, like especially people like Dexter Gordon, for instance. He lived here for 14 years.
Yeah.
And even learned Danish, to speak Danish. He Niels Henning Petersen and Alex Riel, some of the great Danish musicians, they were basically mentored by these people, by playing with them every night in this club we had here called Jazz Club Montmartre.
Yeah, sure.
And so by the time I was came on the scene, there was still a lot of these guys alive and around here. So this was like the mid 70s. So I started playing classical guitar because my father's a classical guitar teacher.
Okay.
I started guitar in my hand, said, okay, now time for you to learn music. I didn't choose it. I said, oh, okay. But then by the time I was 11, this was when I was 7 years old. And then when I was 11, I discovered the piano, fell in love with the piano, and switched to piano, and then started playing and going to jam sessions and started playing around Copenhagen quite young. And I was 13 when I did my first gig here. And then by the time I was 15, I met Thad Jones, who lived here.
Okay.
Thad Jones, amazing, legendary. He had moved here to conduct the Danish radio big band. So he lived here for at least 4 years, I think. And married a Danish woman, had a child here, and I think he lived. Did he live here till he passed? I think he did. Into the 80s. Anyway, he's buried here. He lived here. So anyway, I got started playing with him, and this was a very, very life-changing experience, because he was like a major jazz genius, and I knew this, and I asked, so I begged him. I said, please give me some advice. Tell me when I'm doing wrong or what I could do better. And at first he was like, yeah. But then after a while he was like, okay, let me give you a couple of things. So he showed me, first he showed me something very basic pianistically. He said, okay, when you're playing all this stuff up here, you're basically, when you're improvising, you're basically playing the harmony. So you don't need to play the whole harmony in your left hand. You can just play a few notes, maybe 2 notes, 3 at the most. You don't need to have the whole chord spelled out in your left hand. Just play a few notes just to support what you're doing up here. That's the first thing he told me. Then he told me a second thing that was really, really significant. He said, when you play, you have to listen to the other musicians the whole time, even he told me this in an intermission between the first set and the second set. The first time we played together, he said, you sound good, but please try this. So when you play, listen at all times, even when you're soloing. When you're soloing, your solo is not about you and the others following you. It's about you. Your solo is really an accompaniment to accompany the musicians. It's like an integrated whole. So try it, see what happens. Trust me, and I did. And I realized the music just jumped to another level by doing that. I was really astonished, and it was a really, really important lesson. So anyway, so I got to know him. At that time, I was 15. I was I had just started high school, and very quickly he told me, Niels, you need to go to the States. There's not enough challenge opportunity for you here. You need to go to the US. So let me write you a letter of recommendation for Berklee College of Music. And you apply to get in there. And you use this letter also to apply for funding. Because in Denmark, there's like some funding you can apply for to go study abroad, especially at that time, because at that time there was no other jazz conservatories. And there's a rule in Denmark that is if education is not available in the country, you can go abroad and bring some Danish funding, partial funding to apply to that education abroad. So at least that was the case back then. So that's what I did. So I applied, got some funding, and started at Berklee right after high school. So I was there from 1981. I had come over for a summer program in the summer of 80. Then I started full-time 81, September of 81, and graduated in May 84. And while I was there, I quickly became aware of the fact that the ultimate challenge, the ultimate step for somebody in jazz at that point, in America at least, but also globally, was to move to New York. That was like still the mecca of jazz. So if you really wanted to make it in the jazz world, you just had to be in New York. There was no way around it. So so there was more question: what does one dare?
Yeah.
Like that. So while I was at Berklee, I met. There was a lot of interesting people there at the time when I was there. So, like just to give you an example, like Jeff Watts and Branford Marsalis had just finished when I got there, but they were still around. I got to play with Branford, Donald Harrison. I played with Diana Krall was there.
Oh, really? Oh, okay.
Mark Ledford, who was later in the Pat Metheny group. To see who else. Makoto Ozone, piano player, and David Kikoski was there.
Oh, really? Oh, wow.
And Greg Osby. But one important person that was there was Terry Lynn Carrington.
Ah, that's why you played together later. Okay.
Yeah, she's from Boston, and she's like this wonder kid drummer that, she played with Roland Kirk when she was 5, and wonder kid in the true sense of the word. So I ended up in my second year there, September 82. I ended up in an ensemble at Berklee where she was also in it. So she was the drummer, and so we got to play every week. I think twice a week. Became friends and started playing together and outside of school, also on gigs, local gigs in Boston. And I already thought back then she's like an insane, amazing drummer, and she already back then. So I was like, wow, this was really a great experience for me to play with somebody like that as I was developing my my style of playing, and we did a lot of duo sessions, just piano and drums, just jamming. Anyway, so long story short, we both decided around the same time where we wanted to move to New York. So we decided, okay, why don't we do it together? Get an apartment together. So we went down and drove down in her car to look at apartments, and we stayed with Steve Grossman, the saxophone player, and his girlfriend. And we had met them in Boston. He came up and played with a local rhythm section. We were part of his local rhythm section, so we got to know them, and we stayed with them when we were down there. And we went out and looked for apartments, and we found one in Spanish Harlem. So we were living there in Spanish Harlem in the beginning. And so that's how I got to New York. That's how I got to New York in '84. So basically, I graduated in May of '84, but we had already gotten the apartment by April 1st, 1984.
Wow.
So I was already in New York basically right away. And the first thing that we did in New York when we got there was we went out and hang out every night. There was no social media or anything like that, so you just had to go out physically and meet people.
Yep.
And there was a lot of after hours jam sessions and stuff like that where musicians could meet each other. Like the Blue Note in New York would have every night after the last set, they would have a jam session hosted by Ted Curson. So as soon as the last set, the main act was playing, he would go run up on stage with his rhythm section, start playing, and all the young upcoming players, and sometimes some of the established ones would come and jam, and you could meet a lot of people this way. And we were doing that every night, and then sometimes ending up having breakfast because this was late. You were playing till regular gigs were till 1 a.m. So the jam session started then and ran till late. And sometimes just play all night, go to have breakfast, and then go home. We did that for 3 months in a row and met a lot of people.
Yeah.
And Terry knew a lot of people already because she had been on the scene since she was a kid. I mean, she was on national television as a 6-year-old playing drum duets with Buddy Rich. So a lot of people, especially drummers, came to see us in our apartment in Harlem. So sometimes I would walk out of my room and Terry would be there with Louis Hayes or Billy Hart, Jack DeJohnette, famous drummers. She knew all the famous drummers. So that was interesting. And I knew some people too because I had played with Thad Jones since I was 15, and then a lot of the American New York jazz musicians had played in Denmark. So when they heard I was from Denmark, it was kind of an asset actually. They were like, "Oh, you're from Denmark? Do you know so and so?" "Yeah, I know them." "Oh, wow, blah blah." So easier to break the ice with meeting new people than if I hadn't had those references. So that helped too. So this is basically how I got to New York. So I stayed there full time until 1989. Then I moved to Paris when I met my first wife, who's from Paris. But I kept my apartment in New York, and by that time my brother had just moved over there. My brother was a bass player, and he wanted to live in New York. So he was kind of staying in the apartment, and I was kind of commuting for a while because my wife worked for the airlines, so I could get really cheap
tickets,
almost free tickets. So I was trying to live in Paris, but I still had to go back for work in New York, and but then after a while, we had kids, and the whole life in Paris got really consolidated. So I gave up. I eventually gave up the apartment in New York and gave my handed the lease over entirely to my brother. So that's basically how I got in and out of New York.
But in this period, you made your debut, those records here then, and The Target with Dijonette, and I think the first record I got from you was, being a guitarist, Daybreak with Scofield, of course, and
wow,
I love that one, and the one with Bob Burke, and how did these records happen? How did you get those musicians? I mean, you became part of this group of musicians, like Tom Harrell played with Scofield a lot, and you played with Tom and with Billy Hart, and Bob Burke was there. Like, how did all these things happen, actually?
Yeah, actually, I'm happy to mention Bob Burke, because I've been thinking a lot about him lately. I heard him for the first time in Copenhagen. When I was going to high school, there was the Montmartre Jazz Club was having a lot of great music, and I would go out a lot to hear it, and sometimes come home late and be very tired in school the next day. But one of the groups I heard in I think maybe 1978 or something like that was Theodore Walton's quartet featuring Bob Burke, Billy Higgins, and Sam Jones, and I thought he was an amazing, saxophone player. I loved his playing. I mean, I really loved his playing, more so than most other saxophone players I had heard. Yeah, so I just kind of naturally gravitated towards wanting to get in touch with him when I eventually got to New York, and he and somehow we did end up playing together. I think in 1985 we did an engagement at a club called the West End Cafe, where we played the quartet, him, me, and Billy Hart on drums, and Curtis Lundy on bass. Yeah. And so that's kind of where it started. So, but we really didn't start touring together till 1987. But anyway, yeah, I got, so I tend to just gravitate towards the musicians I like. Bob was one of them. Tom Harrell, of course, yeah, and Scofield. Scofield has had historically a very close ties to Denmark. He's been in Denmark a lot. He's got a lot of close friends there, and he used to come there very, very often. And a lot of Danish people loved his playing, I think maybe long before he became a major star, on the guitar. But yes, it was natural for me to gravitate towards him too, so after a while I had made the connection that, and then the more you make, the easier it becomes. One leads to another, and by the time I called Randy Brecker to play on my record, I said, "Hey, my name is Niels Lan Doky. I'm a pianist from Denmark." He was like, "Yeah, I know. I heard about you, and I'll be happy to play on your record." So okay, so he appeared on Dreams. By then, I knew all the other guys on that album already. But Randy, that was our first time playing together.
What about Mike? Did you play with Mike also?
Yeah, but that was later. That was later. I started with Randy. So the way I got my first record contract was with the Danish label Storyville, who was a jazz label that specialized mainly in producing albums with American jazz artists. But some of their representatives came to New York in, I think, 1985, and heard me in a small club, and offered to sign me. No, actually, the way it happened was I was starting to play with Niels Henning Ørsted Petersen, my Danish mentor.
Yeah,
became a mentor, and I contacted the Danish record company Steeplechase, and used to record all these American musicians who lived in Denmark. And I said, we'd like to do a record for you. And the owner, Niels Winter, he was like, yeah, let me think about it. And he was like a little reluctant. And then after, I had this tour coming up with Niels Henning and Albin Queen, the drummer.
Okay, that's
and I told Niels Henning, yeah, it's not looking like it's coming together, and he said, why don't we try Storyville? So he actually contacted Storyville and said,
oh, okay,
that you should check out this guy Niels. He's worthy of a recording. So they were going to New York for some other purpose, and then they looked me up and came and heard my gig there in a small club called the Angry Squire. And then they decided to offer me a recording contract. So I did my first few records with them. So the first one was Niels Henning and Albin Queen. We did it on a day off during our tour in January of '86 was when it was recorded. And then it was a success when it came out. So I did recorded a follow-up in November '86 already. Yeah. And that was Niels Henning and Jack DeJohnette.
How did you hook up with Jack?
Through Terry Lynn Carrington.
Okay.
She was very close with him and his family, and so she introduced me, and of course Niels Henning was he was very famous by then. Yeah. So Jack knew who he was. And Jack was very bowled over by the fact that Niels Henning had played with Bud Powell. So he was very intrigued by that. So we went to dinner at Jack's house and talked about that. And Jack is a piano player.
Yeah, he's a monster player. Yeah,
I have his album. Piano. He's a really a good piano player, and so he was very. He was questioning Niels Henning about Bud Powell. So he was very happy to do it, and we did this album, which by the way is being remastered and going to be re-released soon. Yeah. So so that's how that came about. So I did a number of records for Storyville. Then in 1988, I think fall of '88, maybe, I was in Japan on my first tour there. And I got approached by JVC Victor, which is a big Japanese label, and one of the oldest labels, maybe not the oldest. I think King Records might be older, but one of the oldest record labels in Japan. They approached me and said, we'd like to sign you. And in those days, and still, I guess, a lot of Japanese labels only release their records in Japan because it's such a big jazz market. They don't need to release elsewhere, and also culturally there was a language barrier, so they were not doing a lot of business outside of Japan. So they said it's not so interesting for you to be signed just here if you're having an international career. So why don't we contact our license partner in the US, Milestone Records, or Fantasy Records, which is a group of labels own Prestige, Milestone, and a few other labels. So why don't we contact them and propose that they sign you? Then we will automatically get the license rights for Japan, and it will be better for everyone. And it's also a prestigious label in the US. It'll be good for you. So they did that. They arranged for that. So the American label agreed to that. So I got signed to Milestone Records and did the Dreams album as the first one, where the one you mentioned before was Scofield, Randy Brecker, Bob Berg, and Adam Nussbaum, and my brother played bass on it. He had just moved to New York by then. So that's how that came about, and it coincided with the end of my Storyville contract. And actually, the Storyville label also had a collaboration with the fantasy label, so they were kind of distributing their label in not Europe but Scandinavia, at least I think. So it wasn't like there was still kind of part of the family. So it all kind of worked out that way. But then I did a second record for Milestone called Friendship, where half of it was recorded in New York and the other half was recorded in Copenhagen. And that did pretty well also, but not as good as the first one. And I had, one of the reasons was that I had, by the time it came out, I had left New York.
Sure.
I was no longer in the US promoting my supporting my releases with live gigs there. So the label said, we're sorry, we're not going to renew your contract. Here are the sales numbers. You know, we don't do art for art's sake, even though we'd like to, but we can't. So you know, so they didn't renew the contract after I moved to Paris, basically. So so I started doing some independent recording for some independent European labels, well, also some Japanese. I think I started around that time, and then I did one for Sony Columbia, and then eventually ended up on EMI Blue Note, and then Polygram Verve. So it was a bit of a jungle after that, you know. But Storyville, the first one was the longest. I think I did. How many records did I do for them? Maybe 6 or 5.
Yeah, I think it's like 5 or 6. Yeah, that's incredible. I wanted to ask you also one thing about John Abercrombie. You mentioned Adam Nussbaum and Chris, your brother, and you guys did that Toronto concert album, which is out. Like, how was John like playing with him, and how did you hook up with him?
We've done a lot of we did a lot of work with him. He appeared on my Friendship record, my second record for Milestone, and I think that's where we got to know each other. I called him to guest appear on that, and we became good friends, and he's really nice to work with. And we did a tour of I was going to say North America, but it was really only Canada.
Oh yeah, the festival circuits.
Plus one gig in New York, which during that tour I did one gig in New York, but that was a solo piano gig at Carnegie Recital Hall with as part of I think the Newport Jazz Festival, one of those JBC Jazz Festival, I think it was called at the time. So we did this tour, and it was my brother and I and Adam Nussbaum and John Abercrombie. And while we were in Toronto, we did an outdoor concert in a big square there, and it was done as a radio broadcast, and we were able to acquire the rights to the recording, which was done at quite good quality, and so we released it as a CD and called it the Toronto Concert.
Yeah, some beautiful playing there.
He was he's one of the great guitarists.
Man,
wonderful man too. We really enjoyed touring with him, and he's unfortunately no longer with us. But I'm happy to have. I started as a guitar player, and then I switched. But I'm happy to have played with some great guitar players.
Oh man, yeah, definitely.
John is definitely one of them. So
Niels, just to not take more of your time, like on this Sunday, so you can slowly go to lunch. But what are your plans for the upcoming year? I mean, like you mentioned, there's a new record maybe in the making? Or
Yeah, I mean,
like...
I have quite a few things coming up. I mean, I have a Danish trio that I tour with mostly in Denmark. When I do extensive tours of Denmark, we usually do 15, 20 cities every year. I tour 15, 20 cities, and we did a live recording at the Louisiana Museum of Modern Art last year. That's coming out on as a double vinyl soon.
Okay.
Yeah. It's called Yesterday's Future, so we're going to release that. I'm happy to see the vinyl is kind of booming, at least in Denmark. You know, there's more and more shops popping up, and so now I'm doing a double vinyl. There'll be a digital download code inside.
Super. Okay.
So it's mostly back older tunes, but also some new ones. So that's coming out, and then the Jazz Tech supergroup that I toured with last fall with Bill Evans, Daryl Jones, and Harvey Mason, we're putting out a record too.
Oh wow! Okay, with that material.
Yeah, we're preparing that
okay.
right now.
Fantastic.
Preparing that right now, and then I'm working on I've been working for 2 years on a new record of original music of mine that. I just haven't had time to finish it, but I'm planning to finish it. We're hoping to get it out by September.
Fantastic.
And it's I've done it the way I've done it is I've written brand new material, you know, once in a while, and then whenever some interesting musicians have been in Denmark, I've asked them to spare a little time to come to a recording session at my house. I moved in 2019. I moved to a house where I have a studio, where I have a recording studio. So I've had a lot of great people play on different. So it's kind of one of those records with like a lot of people on them, but just a few things each. So Steve Rodby and Paul Wertico on it, Mike Stern. Greg Hutchinson, Terry Lynn Carrington, yeah. So it's and more to come maybe between now and September. So that's kind of what I'm working on, and we're doing a new tour with the Jazz Tech's supergroup in April, May, and we're doing. On International Jazz Day, April 30th, we're playing a big concert in Aarhus, Denmark, where we have guests added. We have Mino Sinedu and Mike Stern added as guests, and we're hoping to do a live broadcast.
Fantastic!
You know, online streaming. So working on that at the moment. So.
Beautiful.
Yeah, that's kind of it.
Yeah, fantastic. Beautiful. Looking forward to hear the new stuff. So beautiful. Cool. Sir, thanks so much for sharing some of this stuff. Appreciate it.
Thank you. It was a great pleasure, and hope to see you in Slovenia.
Yeah,
sometime.
If you're near, let me know. I'll
I have your contact now, and then if you come
have a beer together
to Denmark. If you come to Denmark, do let me know, and let's meet up.
Thanks. I will.
Great.
Thanks so much. Have a nice Sunday.
Thank you. All right, you too.
Bye.
Dr. Jazz.